Yeah, good morning to you, Marion. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you this morning or this evening here. I'm going to share my screen now, so just give me a moment while I get that organized. So just to confirm, you should be looking at stripes. Is that right? Marion, Holly, can you just let me know you see it okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, good. So you're probably familiar with these. These are climate stripes. Climate stripes show the increase in temperature over a long period of time, a century, perhaps longer. These happen to be the climate stripes for New York City. And of course, green represents cool, red represents warmer. And we see that over the century, New York has increased its average temperature quite considerably. Here we have Western Australia. This is also climate stripes, a different version, same website. This is from showyourstripes.info if you're not already familiar with it. So they take the average from 1971 to 2000, use that as a baseline. So as you can see from 1901, things were cooler and they've gotten increasingly warm since then. Not a surprise to you, I'm sure. Here we have a global view, same concept going back to 1850. We have a little bit more data on that. So what's going on? Well, you know the story very well. We're increasing our CO2 emissions and that's driving up the temperature. So fossil fuel usage for energy, cement, steel production, et cetera. And that's causing droughts and all kinds of catastrophes, which we're all experiencing. Here we have climate stripes shown against the global awareness of climate change, the first climate conference in 1979 up to today. And you can see this is the ascending line is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the vertical stripes are the temperature increase. So there doesn't seem to be any doubt about it. Here in the States, we do have a significant faction of people who are in massive denial and who are unfortunately in positions of political power, and that's really been a barrier for us. But globally, it's pretty well understood that we are in a climate emergency. Again, I'm not expecting that this is news for you, but it is important context for what we're going to be talking about. Interestingly enough, more than 100 years ago, scientists became aware of this phenomenon. So here you see August 14th, 1912. This is a newspaper from New Zealand, so just across the Tasman Sea from you. And at the bottom of the note, and this is literally the entire article, it's just a little blurb. At the bottom it says, the effect may be considerable in a few centuries, which I call a triumph of understatement. It is considerable, and it was less than a few centuries. This is from yesterday. So as you're probably familiar, massive fires in the Mediterranean region, tremendous heat wave across all of Europe, causing tremendous deaths. And this sign, which I saw on a BBC news site, extreme heat, plan your journey, carry water. The UK, if I understand correctly, is experiencing heat that it has never, ever experienced before certainly in recorded history. So we are in a global crisis. Now, here are climate stripes, but perhaps you noticed that the stripes are reversed. So we have the heat on the left and cooling on the right. This is what we have to do as a society globally. And so on the cover of our book, Net Zero City, Farah and I realized that being optimists and promoting a strategy for how to get to net zero, we wanted to reverse the climate stripes. So a lot of people recognize that there are climate stripes on the cover, and then they do a double take and they go, well, wait a minute, it's cooler on the right. And we say, yeah, because that's what we have to do. Over the next century, we have to reverse what we've done over the last century. And the purpose of the book is to describe how to do that. I think that will probably be of interest to you in Perth. We've found great interest globally. So just a little bit about myself and Farah. So Farah, as Marion mentioned, is based in Dubai. She is a lead strategist for AECOM, which is a global engineering and architecture firm. She's working on many of the very interesting urban development projects throughout the Middle East, including in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, among others. I'm based in New York, but I highlighted London there because it was in London that I was studying with Marion at the London School of Economics. And the book is a direct consequence of my studies. I extrapolated my thesis into a book with the help of Farah. Farah was my thesis advisor and became my co-author. So that's our global partnership. Obviously, it's very warm in the Middle East right now. It's tremendously warm in the UAE. So they're experiencing a heat wave as well. Now, what all this does is it presents a challenge to human civilization, in effect. There's no reason to say anything other than that. We are challenged. If we don't change our behavior, if we don't change our energy consumption habits and move away from fossil fuels, then we are really looking at a dramatically horrible situation. So we have to shift. And the premise of the book is that we do have to shift, and we will shift. And we have to shift on a lot of levels. So we have to shift our systems, our urban systems and our living systems. We have to shift our behaviors at the level of nations, but also at the level of individuals and families and companies. For this, we require new policies and new designs if we're in one of the design profession. We're going to substantially reformulate the entire economy, which requires a new energy infrastructure. So all of these factors are going to be changing in the near future. And again, our perspective as optimists, we say that this has to start pretty much now, and it's going to have to continue for quite a long time. And really what we're talking about is the largest, the most significant designed transformation in human history. Never has global society attempted to do something like this. So we have essentially a unique opportunity to remake global civilization. And really that's the scope of the challenge. It's a little bit presumptuous to say that. It sounds a little bit grandiose, I recognize that. But if you think about what we're going to have to do, essentially that's it. And therefore we realize that we can't do this alone. No individual country can tackle it alone because carbon dioxide doesn't respect national boundaries. We can only accomplish this by working together on a global basis. So what do we have to do? Well, according to the IEA, we have to significantly transform the economy to an electrical basis. We have to electrify the entire economy and cut our use of oil, coal, and natural gas to almost nothing. They say we have to do this by 2050. Scientists might tell you that that's a little bit conservative, and really we have to do it much more quickly than that. Already it's happening, however. So here we see investment in non-renewables and renewables, and you can see where the investment's going. On the left side, you see gigawatts per year. So we're still not there yet. We still have a huge, huge distance to travel in terms of creating more renewable energy capacity, as well as the storage capacity, as well as the electrical grid capacity. But the market was already driving this process. The cost of solar energy and wind energy to generate it has dropped enormously over the last 25 years. And so we do see that economically and from an engineering standpoint, it's quite possible. Financially, however, it's a different story. We're talking about something that's going to cost in the order of magnitude of $100 trillion. Now, nobody really knows what that much money is. So, you know, it might be 80 trillion, it might be 150 trillion. At that scale, sort of, who cares and who knows? But it's a big number, and it's going to require, as I said, an economic transformation. That transformation is already happening at the grassroots level, but it's going to have to be accelerated at the nation level and at the multi-nation level. Now, our particular focus in the book is on cities. As you remember, the title of the book is Net Zero City. And we chose the city because the city is really a very coherent policy and governance unit. Cities are governed by people who generally have to make things happen at the national level in many countries, certainly here in the US. We get involved in ideology, and we get involved in sort of nonsensical disputes about who believes what. But at the city level, mayors have to make a city work. And if they don't make the city work, then they often lose their jobs, and they lose their jobs quite quickly. So a city is a reasonable scale. And if we were able to transform those, say, the largest 1,000 cities on the globe, that would significantly advance us towards the process of reversing the climate stripes. So that raises the question, if the city is the proper focus of our attention, then how do you transform a city? And again, this was a topic that Marianne and I studied in great detail at the London School of Economics in the Cities program. We both felt very fortunate to participate in the program, and it really had a huge impact, certainly on my thinking, and I think on Marianne's as well. So in order to conceptualize this, Farah and I developed what we called an urban system framework. The notion is that we have to think of the city as a system. We have to think of it as one system, and we have to manage it as one system. In fact, of course, it's a system of systems. There's the public sector, the private sector, the family sector, the education sector, et cetera, et cetera. You can break it down quite to a quite fine level of granularity. But the point is that to change the economic structure of the city and the energy infrastructure of the city, we have to think of it in systematic terms. So adapting the work that we did at London School of Economics, Farah and I developed this concept on the notion that it's not going to be a simplistic problem. It has to be taken in an integrated fashion. And there are a few key elements that we have to think of in a systematic fashion. So there are 5 in particular that, excuse me, that we felt were particularly important, and that's what I'm going to share with you here. The first of those is urban governance and policy. So the leadership of the city, as I was talking about, both at the mayoral level, at the government level, leadership of the private sector, the participatory nature of decision-making in a city, all those are hugely influential. So if the leaders of a city and the citizens of a city decide that they're going to transform and become net zero, it could certainly happen. If they decide it's not going to happen, it probably won't happen. Excuse me, I'm getting over a little touch of COVID here, so I have a little tickle in my throat. Second element of our framework is urban design, the actual physical design of the cities, the buildings and the elements of the structures of the city. Of course, they have to be designed from a net zero perspective from the beginning, or we have to do a massive amount of retrofitting. The third element is the urban infrastructure, which is the tools and methods that we use to move energy, water, information, people, and goods around. So roads, pipes, tunnels, bridges, all that sort of thing. And of course, the energy infrastructure of the city is the critical part of it in terms of this conversation. So how does the city get its energy? How is energy generated? How is it distributed? Is it centralized or decentralized? Is it solar or is it hydrocarbon based? The fourth element is what happens when you put all the people in the city together and they start to interact. That's the urban economy. So it's creating wealth, taxing it, investing it, and spending it. So those are 4 critical elements of an urban system framework. Now, you could make an argument that there might be another 5 or 6 or 8, but when you're thinking about it, you have to sort of draw the line somewhere. So we recognized that these 4 were critical, but then we realized that there's also a 5th element which sort of overlaps the other 4, and that's urban society and culture. And we put that as an overlap because in a sense, culture emerges from all the other 4. So the culture of a city is a consequence of urban design. It's a consequence of its infrastructure. It's a consequence of governance, and it's a consequence of the economic success and the economic viability of a city. So culture and society, how we live together, how we create culture, how we innovate, how we create technology, ultimately how we create civilization. So what we began to see is that in order to transform the city, in order to make it net zero, we had to think about how to work at all 5 of these levels. Now, obviously in the book, we go into a tremendous amount more detail about these. In fact, the structure of the book actually follows this model that I'm showing you on the screen. So there's a major section in the book on each of these 5 topic areas, and that constitutes about half of the book. As you can see on the bottom, the 2 on the right are mostly tangible, the 2 on the left are mostly intangible. So then that raises the question, well, how do we do it? And Farah and I recognize that what we need is a roadmap. We need a process map that tells us what's step 1, what's step 2, what do we have to do in order to transform this very, very complex system. In fact, it would be reasonable to say that the city is one of the most complex systems that civilization has ever created. The global economy is probably a little bit more complex, but a city in its essence is really the essence of complexity. And that's one of the reasons that we love cities so much. They're so interesting, they're so fascinating. They can be so beautiful and so inspiring, precisely because they bring together all these diverse elements. So in thinking about a roadmap, Farah and I said, well, we're going to have to break it down into steps. And so again, we took the notion that we have to do this in 10 years as a requirement. So we took that as a step from the beginning. And so the red dashed line represents the emissions, the CO2 emissions from the city. And as you can see, we propose that by 2032, net zero would be achieved. And the other qualities of the 2032 reality are that it's a city which is resilient, equitable, zero carbon, and very, very livable. And then we divided it into 4 phases. One of the reasons that we did this is because Farah is an engineer and she likes to think in a very structured way. And she said, well, it's not just we do it and it's done. It has to be organized in phases. And so we thought about what those phases might be. And we said, well, we have to assess what's going on. We have to act and experiment. And then we have to accelerate our capacity to make change. And then we have to achieve our goal. So as you can see, we actually would expect that about 60% of the total reduction in fossil fuel emissions would be achieved in phase 3. So phase 1 is less about reducing fossil fuel emissions and more about understanding and planning. Phase 2 is about learning and experimenting, making lots and lots of tests, doing small investments and finding out what works the best. Phase 3 is about expanding the scope of investment on a massive scale in order to literally transform the city, both in its physical and its virtual realms. And then achieving the last 10% is, the last 10% of any change is very tricky, but once you're 90% of the way there, you can see how to glide to the finish line. Now, across that, we mapped the 5 elements of the infrastructure, and you can see that we've actually divided the infrastructure module that I just described of the framework into 3 different elements here, because we felt that those three sub-elements of infrastructure were important. So the first of those is the few nexus, few meaning food, energy, and water. So how can we provide food, energy, and water security to all the citizens of the city? And as we see with climate change, that becomes increasingly difficult to do as water becomes scarce, food becomes scarce, and energy has also become scarce. So thinking about how to provide that security is a critical element that any infrastructure design has to address. The energy transformation that I've talked about, obviously the $100 trillion problem, that's a core element. And then what we realized, and this was a learning to us and a bit of a surprise, was that data and analytics are actually going to be critical elements of this entire transformation. And I'm going to address that a little bit later on in this presentation. So those 7 elements became the 7 tracks on the roadmap. And then we divided the roadmap into the 4 phases that I showed you earlier. And there you see the roadmap in detail. And the point of this is not to suggest that Perth needs to follow exactly this roadmap. Any city, including Perth, would come up with its own roadmap. But we wanted to do a little bit of the thinking for you and say, well, what would be the first thing you would do? And what would you do next? And how would you work at the governance level? And how would you work at the urban design level? And how would you work at the economic level? And how would you manage innovation across the city? So we developed this roadmap. And if you're interested, it's available as a free download on the book website. I'll show you that web address in a little bit. The full document is about 1.5 meters by about 1 meter. So it's quite detailed. It's big enough that you can actually read it. I realize that you can't read it on the screen here. Another element of the roadmap that you can't see, but I'll describe, is that there are lots of little circles, little numbers with circles in them, and those link the contents of the book back to the roadmap. So in the book, we identified 112 positive examples of how cities around the world are moving towards net zero in various ways across all 7 of these dimensions. And those are tagged back to the roadmap. So you can, if you're interested in a particular solution, you can link back from the book to the roadmap or from the roadmap to the book and get a much longer, more detailed description of what happened in a particular city. We found examples all around the world from all continents, from all cultures, some very fascinating, some incredibly innovative, many of them very, very impactful. In the book, there are actually 113 examples. 112 are good, and one is a don't do this at home. It was an example of what not to do. So that's the transformation roadmap. So in a sense, the whole purpose of the book is to describe the roadmap and to say, yes, we can do this. We can do this here in the US. You can do it there in Western Australia. Perth should have its own transformation roadmap. There's no reason why it shouldn't. And there's every reason why it should, because as I said, this is a global problem and we're all going to have to work together in order to address it. Why 10 years? Well, two reasons. One, because that's what the scientists are telling us. So if you listen to the UN scientists and in the Climate Change Convention, they're quite clear that if we don't get a handle on reducing carbon emissions by 2032, that we're looking at a very, very hot and very, very difficult century ahead of us. So 10 years is realistic from a scientific perspective. It's currently not realistic from a political perspective, but it's up to us to make it realistic. And then the other reason is because of things like this. Do we really have to ask? If we just look around and see what's happening in the world today, we know that this is something we have to do. Yes, the wildfires, the heat waves. Now, I want to close by mentioning a little bit more about the issue of data. And as I mentioned, this was something that Farah and I discovered as we were going through working on the book. Because what we're really talking about is a lot of change at the policy level. Governance plays a critical role. That's why the upper left corner of our urban system framework is governance. And yet, if you're in a governance position, if you're in a leadership position in a city, for example, it's not that easy to know what the right actions are to take. As I said, we found 112 examples of actions that were being taken around the world. So which of those 112 would make the most sense for Perth? Well, the only way we're going to find out is to gather the data. And currently the data essentially don't exist. This was a tremendous gap, and Farah pointed that out to me because she's doing work in urban development throughout the Middle East. And she was very clear, the developers and the nations that are sponsoring these urban developments don't have the data. So they're making a lot of decisions without data, and we know how that's going to turn out. What we realized further is that what's required is what we call an urban twin. So if you're in the building industry, you may be familiar with the digital twin. A digital twin is the notion of a building represented in computer code so that it can be modeled. It's used both during the design phase and as well as in the maintenance and management phase. But we want to scale the digital twin up to be an urban twin. And this obviously creates a massive data problem because we're talking about a huge quantity of data that's presently completely incompatible. But we were able to articulate sort of a model of how this might look. So first of all, we need data sources, and there are dozens, if not hundreds of data sources that we have to tap in order to come up with a good urban twin model. We have to manage that data, and we have to provide security and access to it. So obviously, it's going to be a tremendously important role to make sure that such a database is secure. And once we get done with those three steps, then the interesting work can start. Because then the analytics can begin in order to figure out what the right policy is, and an urban digital strategy can be developed. So, we can integrate energy transformation with IoT, Internet of Things, urban systems modeling, resource optimization, logistics, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, that enables us to implement. So we move from the realm of leaders having to do guesswork to leaders having substantial basis in evidence and fact for policy decisions that they may be making in their city. So that then creates the basis for net zero to be achieved. Now, as we looked around the sort of the marketplace of data, there was another problem, which is that we didn't find any technical solutions to this kind of problem. You may or may not be familiar with the current situation of large data sets in corporations, but corporations these days are spending tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to try to get their data picture in order, and they're struggling with it. So we talk about digital native companies like Apple and Google, or Alibaba in Asia, for example, which are built around an understanding of data, and they use data and analytics and AI as a core element of their business process. But other firms that are not digitally native are struggling with this data problem. And as I said, they're spending tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to not solve the problem. And then we happened across a firm that developed an entirely new data management platform. And it's the platform that provides the insights that leads to the results. So we became very interested in working with them. And we observed that the data itself on the left side of the model, if we talk about the value of a single piece of data, it's essentially nothing. I mean, we're talking about bits and bytes, but the value is only creating the value at the right side of the model in implementation is only possible if you have the data from the left side of the model. So even though the data themselves are essentially valueless, the ability to aggregate data and analyze the aggregates is priceless and incredibly valuable. So we decided to partner with a data management firm called Modern. So the Modern Data Company, Marion mentioned it when she introduced me. And so we introduced the notion of modern net zero urban data science. And the Modern platform is designed to solve this kind of problem. Modern is a Silicon Valley startup. It's venture backed, and it's starting to have a significant amount of traction globally because its data management paradigm is completely different. So perhaps you in Perth would be interested in learning more about this. If you are, of course, I'd be very happy to spend time with you. If you're not, the underlying point I think is still valid, which is that you have to solve the data problem in order to get to the point where you're developing evidence-based policy, because evidence-based policy is the only way to transform the structure, the economic structure, and essentially the urban landscape of the city. Again, otherwise you're just basing it on guesswork, which is ultimately going to be unsatisfying and lead to not the results that we're all looking for, shall we say. Last point I think to make is that this is a process that must be driven by leadership. So I know Marion is a leader there in Perth, and I know she works very closely with other civic leaders and other leaders in the private sector. And together, this is a challenge that I hope that you realize today that you have to face, and that you're perhaps a little more inspired to step up and begin to create your master plan and make a set of policy changes for Perth that will help Perth to become perhaps a global leader in this net zero shift. So there's the website, and oh, that's a shame. It's cut off at the bottom. So I'll just read it to you. It says www.net.netzerocitybook.com. That's the website. As I mentioned, there's a page on the website where you can download the roadmap for free and other material as well. Some summaries of the book, some of the graphics that we use in the book, including the urban systems framework. And I think that's my last slide.
Wonderful. Thank you, Langdon.